So we're in London for software-defined operations and the autonomous network. I'm here with Carl Moberg from Cisco. Carl, good to see you.
You too, man, you too.
So you've just given us a keynote with a new title, a new topic, which is always exciting and always good to see at any event. And you were talking about the self-publishing network. What is this about? Tell us about this concept.
It's the new hot thing, I'll tell you.
Okay.
It's an exciting concept that's come out of a couple of years of working and trying to improve the way networks are managed, right? And fundamentally, I think the way I'm kind of gravitating towards explaining this is the observation that we're getting to a point where we think that networks can actually by themselves tell systems that are interested, for example, order management systems and service providers, what they can do for them, if you see what I mean. So if you think about the intent-based networking, this is the precursor, right?
Okay.
It's the network informing the intentee, the intenter, what it can do for them, and then the intentioning body can actually ask for services.
Okay. Informing in what way? In named services or in models of services or how?
Good one, yes. So it's the coming together of several technologies, and I think there are three things that are important.
Okay.
Yes, first of all, a formal and self-sufficient or complete modeling language. And the definition of that is that the expressiveness of that language, and in our case we believe Yang has a good shot at that, is enough for the systems, right?
Okay.
You don't need a human to translate what it is. You can actually shoot it into the machine and the machine understands it.
Okay.
And then you need ephemeral things like protocols around that, so ways of consuming it, and you need ways of life cycling the actual services themselves. But the new thing is the application then of a full and formal definition language that's enough for the machines to work from.
Okay. And then does that self-propagate based on the capabilities of a network, or does it require some kind of help, assistance?
It will eventually self-propagate,
okay.
Right? It's on the receiving end. And in this case, of course, what we're saying here is that the network is now at a stage where we can do that. But of course, the receiving end, which is the traditional OSS stack, now has a little bit of a shift themselves in order to actually be able to consume those things.
Okay.
So it will be human-propelled, I would suggest, over the first stage here, but eventually OSS systems will be built such that they can, without human help, consume and then further perpetuate those definitions.
Okay, great. And where are we in the stage of development of this? Is this
right.
Is this a concept coming to fruition, or where are we?
I think the basic building blocks are there, as I mentioned in my keynote. You know, actually making things like this happen takes more than just turning up for pleasurable events like this. It actually takes a little bit of standards work, which is time consuming. It actually takes a little bit of interoperability testing, and it takes a little bit of pushing into the vendors themselves to actually do this. And we see movement on all three,
okay.
which is why we are able to do this bold gamble here to say that actually we think this is happening.
Okay, so this is kind of a new concept, but within the broader frame of automation,
yes.
process automation, which of course has become a very big thing in the last couple of years. It's not never been a thing, but I think it's being articulated more.
Yes.
I think especially as the operators realize quite how much they're going to need to automate as they shift into essentially what's
yes.
been called 5G, but which is essentially the next generation network.
Indeed.
So, but this can potentially be very incredibly overwhelming.
It is.
What's a good starting point for operators to get into and start developing their capabilities in terms of automation?
Oh, it's so. As much as I'm a technologist, almost all my customer conversations these days are about people and processes.
Okay.
You know, almost to an uncomfortable extent, right? So I think actually knowledge management is a whole field on its own, right? Actually giving people room to grow into these technologies, both in terms of your operations teams, but also your development team and your OSS teams and your IT teams, I think is going to be key here. These are the types of changes that I don't believe can be forced upon organizations. It's more about the transition from this abstract sense of horror that we should probably do something about this automation thing and turning it into something concrete, right? And you don't do that by forcing frameworks. You do that by training people to start to think about it, right?
Okay.
And create their own understanding. So I think it's a knowledge transfer, a knowledge management issue more than technology. And that's kind of also one of the points that I made, is that we think that the technology is now there, right? It's not what's holding it back.
Okay.
So now it's the people and processes that needs to be.
Harnessing those capabilities.
Exactly right. And it may turn, well, it always turns out to be that when the technology, we think it's done, and people start using it, they come back and go, see what I mean? You know, might want to change some of these things, because when we actually try to use it, it comes up short. So we're excited to see that too, right? We want the first wave of feedback around this.
Absolutely, big learning curve. Yeah. So are there some concrete examples of how network operators are taking not necessarily the first steps, but new steps in the next wave of automation?
Oh, absolutely. And I think what I see with such delight is that I even get questions from large service providers, would you believe it, to help them with recruiting. They actually turn to companies like us to say, what does a good job ad look like for this kind of role that we have
to specify it, to make sure
can you help us recruit people, right? Okay. And with that comes a whole lot of exciting things. One is actually that it turns out that it's hard as a service provider to recruit software talents. Based on the current understanding of what service providers are, doesn't immediately attract top talent, let's just say. So they also have a little bit of a selling, challenge. Now we're pretty far off technology here, but they have to reinvent themselves as an exciting employer, to be honest, to attract the type of software talent that they need away from, pure software companies, right? So that's a pretty big thing. And we see now that we have large service provider customers that have in their operations team actual software programmers, right? Actual software people. And then they start influencing the industry. That's because they join the tribe, if you like. And we see the emergence of, for example, service level Yang models in the IETF, in the MEF. There's some movement in the TMF, right? So as that churn is starting to happen, we're starting to get influence from actual software people, and that starts to take shape in standardization efforts around service definitions and what are those publishable models that can be consumed.
Okay. And have any of the conversations so far got to this topic of the self-publishing network, or is that the next step for the conversation?
Oh, no. So some of our forerunners, and it's always a little cheating, right? There are some outlier service providers that might be very research heavy, or they have a very limited kind of network. We see several of them actually doing this right now. Right. And an exciting part of this industry to look at is actually the carriers, if you see what I mean, the transit carriers. Because they have highly automatable and well understood services, and they run on paper thin margins. So they're under a lot of automation pressure. So an insider scoop tip here is to track what these guys do, because they turn out to be the forerunners in many of these aspects.
And in fact, they're a forerunner in some of the blockchain developments in the industry as well.
True that.
So, absolutely, great point. Carl, great. Thanks very much for telling us about that today.
As usual, thanks for having me.